Good afternoon, I'm Melody Webb. I was lucky enough to be married to Robert Utley for 42 amazing years. On behalf of Bob Utley, I want to welcome you all here today. He would have loved to have seen the crowd, but honestly, he would have been embarrassed. He really was a very modest man. Writing history was his first love, one he shared with his day job of working for the federal government. With hard work, efficient time management, and great skill in writing, he published 23 books, many winning awards and prizes. Yet he always found time to help others in their writing process and projects. Most of the speakers today have learned one way or another from Bob Utley, but I'll let them tell you their stories. Also, I want to draw your attention to Bob's drawings, selected, framed, and displayed by Ginger Bushman and Leslie Compest. While Bob felt his art deserved the trash can, his instructor, Larry Charles, and his colleagues thought otherwise. Take some time to browse through the exhibits of the foyer. Our first speaker today is Paul Hutton, who is the Distinguished Professor of History at the University of New Mexico. He first met Bob in 1977 when he gave Bob a ride from the Indianapolis airport to the Indiana, I knew I was going to stumble on that, Indiana University campus. This was the beginning of a warm friendship as Bob became his professional mentor and a champion over the next 50 years. Paul?
Thank you, Melody. It has been said that the price of love is grief. And indeed, how true that is. So now we gather here with Melody to celebrate the life of a man we dearly loved. Bob Utley was my friend, my professional mentor, and my surrogate father. I guess I truly thought he would go on forever. Certainly I thought I would go first. Bob was disciplined and lived a clean life. Now we must all carry on without him. Our warm memories must sustain us. And indeed, we all carry, I'm sure, great memories. As Melody said, I first met Bob in May of 1977. He came to Bloomington to receive a Distinguished Alumni Award from Indiana University, where I was in graduate school. They hoped to pick his pockets like all universities do when they give awards to people. He returned later to pick up an honorary doctorate from IU in 1983. Purdue University and the University of New Mexico also awarded Bob honorary doctorates. Bob had received his MA from Indiana in 1952 under the direction of Oscar Osborne Winther, once well known as a giant in Western history, and who I had also worked with briefly at IU. And when I heard he was coming, I approached my mentor, Martin Ridge, and begged him for the opportunity to pick Bob up at the Indianapolis airport, some 60 miles away. I said I would simply die for this opportunity, and he thought it was but slight ambition. Well, I picked him up and I delivered him back. I, of course, had read all his books, and I was particularly entranced with his Custer and the Great Controversy. We shared an obsession on General Custer, which had the same source, the 1941 Errol Flynn Warner Brothers film, They Died with Their Boots On, correct in every detail about Custer's life. Bob saw it in 1941 at a theater in Lafayette, Indiana, and I saw it on The Late Late Show in 1965 on TV. Well, this eventful meeting, as Bogart said to Raines in Casablanca, was the beginning of a beautiful friendship. And he would champion me across the next half century. Some years ago, in July of 2007, True West magazine published a cover story on Bob called "The Man Who Saved the West." And indeed, Bob did save the West in a physical sense, and he also saved Western history in particular. As historian and administrator with the National Park Service and the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, he literally wrote the rules that guided government actions over the previous half century. Some in this very room had broken those rules in their zeal to better communicate history to the public, and they felt the sting of his criticism. But with a smile, he would almost forgive them their trespasses. And there was always a word of praise for their misguided zeal. He certainly fought the good fight. And unlike his hero Custer, he always won. As a result, he remains a legendary name within the National Park Service. Asked by an interviewer about what projects he championed that he regretted not being preserved, he promptly responded without a pause, "All the places I worked on extensively ultimately made it into the system, so I have none to mourn." Bob was really never one for false modesty. I frankly don't know how Bob remained modest at all, considering his prodigious outpouring of publications and the innumerable honors and awards he collected on his way to becoming the most important Western historian of the last 50 years. His first publication in 1949, when he was but 19 years old, was a pamphlet, a 54-page pamphlet called Custer's Last Stand. I happen to have 2 signed copies of that beauty, now highly prized on the rare book market, I might point out, even though it embarrassed him to no ends. And so I took great glee in reading him passages from it. Since that little gem appeared, he has filled a small library with 23 books on a wide range of topics, from the Indian Wars to Western outlaws to the Texas Rangers to mountain men, and in countless magazine and journal articles, introductions, forewords, government reports. He has filled pages with our Western heritage. At the same time, he served in several key positions with the National Park Service and the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation from 1947 to 1980, which you'll hear about later, with 4 years off for military service. He was also a founder of the Western History Association and served as its youngest president in 1967-68. His many awards and honors, far too numerous to mention here, include Lifetime Achievement Awards from the Western History Association, the Western Writers of America, the Society for Military History, as well as those 3 honorary doctorates that I mentioned. In the 1990s, he began to appear regularly on Western documentary programs on the History Channel, Discovery, and became quite a noted talking head on the rapidly expanding cable television scene. Well, it's little wonder that Bob enjoyed universal acclaim as the Dean of Western History. Bob believed that to be a great historian, one also needed to be a graceful, accessible writer. And he wrote for the people, not for his peers, be they academic or other historians. And of course, Bob was both a graceful writer and a great historian. The academic crowd did accept him as one of their own, and as is reflected in his presidency of the Western History Association. He was also a marvelous editor. His brutal assessment of my first book manuscript sent me into a year-long depression. After I got out of the fetal position and quit sucking my thumb, I reviewed his critique of my dreary academic doctoral dissertation and rewrote it along the lines that he suggested. He had freed me from the restrictive blinders imposed by graduate school training and taught me how to truly be a writer. He set a particularly high bar to work toward, and I will confess it was daunting to observe his incredible productivity over the years, especially when we became neighbors in El Dorado outside of Santa Fe. In 1984, Bob encouraged me to leave the Utah State University and accept a teaching position at the University of New Mexico, which was Melody's school. And not long afterward, I moved to El Dorado and we became neighbors. Well, we often debated history points as he worked on his books. I urged him to be a bit tougher on his hero Custer and his Cavalier and buckskin, and to cut my hero, Billy the Kid, some slack in his Billy the Kid, A Short and Violent Life. Once he barked at me, Hutton, the problem with you and your whole generation of hippies is that you don't think young people should take responsibility for their actions. Poor Billy was just a kid. Nevertheless, he dedicated Billy the Kid, the book, to me. Well, it was both wonderful and daunting to watch his incredible productivity in those years. You know, a struggling young writer might develop a complex being around Utley. On one memorial occasion, we had both Bob and the Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Scott Momaday over to the house for dinner. Now, Scott was also a huge Billy the Kid fan. And in his novel, The Ancient Child, he wrote about Billy. But I was, of course, just beside myself. I was so excited. I mean, these two literary titans in my house at the dinner table. It was just so wonderful. But great intellectual thoughts would come across that table. What would I learn sitting there at the feet of these giants? Well, they were like a couple of giddy schoolboys going nuts over what kind of gun Billy carried and exactly how many people he killed and just how did he do it. And they seemed to be very proud of how many he killed. We were really deep into the Billy weeds before that night was over. Bob understood, he understood the passion of the history buff, as well as, of course, the standards of solid scholarly history. Well, speaking of those days in El Dorado, I would be remiss if I did not relate the tale of Bob and my Cocker Spaniel, Corky. Oh, Melody, you knew it was coming. And I clean up your part in the story. In 1984, of course, I had left Utah State and moved to New Mexico. And it was in this time in El Dorado that Bob came to truly despise my wonderful little Cocker Spaniel, Corky. Well, this was not a particularly exclusive club, for Corky was not appreciated by any of my friends. Even though he had been a Christmas present to my ex-wife, she had insisted that I take custody of the pup when I left Utah. Because Corky was truly one of the most irritating brain-dead mutts ever to trot across this planet. Now, he and I made the long journey from Logan, Utah to Albuquerque in a rented U-Haul, which broke down at the Shiprock in New Mexico. I mean, just no cell phones. This was, you know, back in covered wagon days. That pup was right by my side all through that horrendous crisis. I just loved that dog. Well, once I moved to El Dorado, Bob and Melody were kind enough to take Corky in whenever I had to travel out of town. Late one snowy winter night, Melody let Corky out to do his business, but the recalcitrant pup refused to come back in. So she reached out to try and get him, and lo and behold, the door slammed shut behind her. And there she was in her nightie, in her negligee, with Corky in the snow. It was a freezing night in El Dorado. And she and Corky, who she later fumed, she didn't take this whole incident well. She said that Corky seemed bizarrely pleased by their plight. Well, that's because he's a people dog. So they trudged to the snow to bang on the bedroom window to awaken her sleeping husband. As I'm sure you know, Bob had very severe hearing loss, and he wore twin hearing aids, which he naturally took out at night. So it actually was some time before he noticed that Melody was not in bed and looked out the window to see a blue apparition and a smiling puppy next to her. After that, they mutually swore that they never wanted to see that dog around their house again. However, a serious family emergency called me back to Indiana, and so they reluctantly agreed to babysit Corky. Upon my return, Bob haughtily declared that my dog had soiled his expensive Indian rug. This is not quite an accurate description of the words that he used. Bob was a master of all kinds of words in the American language, and some languages I had never even heard of. I protested that this was simply not possible, for despite his many obvious faults, Corky had superb bladder control. As we walked across the room toward the door, there was a shrill yelp. And I saw Corky careening across the floor. I said, "My God, Bob, you kicked my dog. Why did you kick my dog?" Well, he muttered a string of truly imaginative curses, and he pointed to his soaked right pants leg, where, yes, indeed, Corky had made a clear statement on his feelings for the great man. Taking my beloved pup by the scruff of the neck, I hurriedly departed. Every year after that infamous leg incident, Corky dutifully sent Bob a birthday card. And they continued, actually, even after Corky had passed on. And every year, Corky received back from Bob a little note, a little love note, suggesting a nearby laboratory that needed test animals. I like to think that they're now happily reunited. Well, I can but ruefully smile as I think back on Bob and Corky and all the wonderful dinners, the long conversations about history and life, the road trips, the conferences that Bob and I shared together, and of course, the guidance, both personal and professional, that I received from him over the years. And of course, you all share such warm memories with me. He bequeathed those to us. He also left us a lasting legacy of grand achievement and a stirring example of how to live life well. Passed on? I think not. Bob lives on. But it's on through the printed page, and that special immortality reserved for our greatest writers. I can hear his voice in every sentence on the page. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. That's a hard act to follow, but Mark Fauché and Dwayne Wadsworth may come close. Mark Fauché is the creator and editor of the video you will see shortly. He is a retired educational software developer who worked with Bob for the last decade, creating and maintaining Bob's website. He also edited and produced the Celebration of Life video, incorporating the photographs that I chose. For narrator of the video, Dwayne Wadsworth has been doing voiceover narration for a variety of clients on video and film for over a decade. As a fellow resident of V, he and Lorna had a chance to get to know Bob and enjoy his writings, which reside on their bookshelf.
Robert Utley wrote 23 books that won awards, but he also took photographs and put them in 22 photograph albums with captions of date, people, and places. The following are a few from his collection, not masterpieces of art, but memories of a wonderful life. Robert Utley was born in a small town of Bauxite, Arkansas, on Halloween, 1929. He modestly observed that his birth probably set off the Great Depression. His father, Don Utley, spent his career as a chemist for Alcoa. His mother, Valeria, was a beautiful woman, but suffered from severe depression. Not relating well to his parents, he came to idolize his grandfather, Joseph Utley, who was the Arkansas Attorney General. Bob underachieved in school until his junior year, when he starred as Charlie's aunt in the school play to great acclaim.
Earl Flynn in They Died with Their Boots On made me a Custer addict. and there are lots of them throughout the country. I was only 12 years old then, but that was during World War II.
Now addicted to Custer at age 16, he visited Custer Battlefield, foisted himself on the superintendent, and begged for a job, despite the fact he was 4 years too young to qualify. Superintendent Edward Luce found a loophole that allowed him to hire Bob, earning his love, admiration, and respect. At last, Bob found a surrogate father. One instance, however, nearly got him fired. He tried on Custer's original uniform, forbidden by law. After graduating Purdue University in 1951 with high grades in history, he moved to Indiana University and finished his master's degree in 2 semesters, with a thesis later published as Custer and the Great Controversy. In 1952, the Army drafted Bob. On his entry photograph, he wrote, "The smile was not genuine." After making his way through officers' candidate school, he became a tactical officer, not his idea of being, quote, an officer and a gentleman, unquote. After 2 years, Bob's friends in the military used their influence to get Lieutenant Utley transferred to the Joint Chiefs of Staff Historical Section. His lieutenant colonel said, "I wish you good luck, Lieutenant, but tell me one thing, how the hell did you do it?" Joining a staff of superb historians, he learned to write, as they pounded clarity, focus, and structure into everything he wrote. By 1959, he was married and had 2 boys, Don and Phil. Moreover, he had left the Joint Chiefs of Staff for a permanent job with the National Park Service in Santa Fe, New Mexico. By 1970, Bob hoped his boys were old enough to travel because he wanted to visit Pancho Villa's widow in Chihuahua City, Mexico. Bob loved his job, especially when products propelled him back to General Custer, such as Custer's victory over the Cheyennes at the Washta. This time, Bob sought out Indians who eagerly told him their version of the battle. Then, December 31st, 1972, brought a shocking blow to Bob. His favorite director and hard-charging boss, George Hartzog, was fired by President Nixon. Hartzog's whole staff assembled for one last picture. Still, Bob's hard work and effective leadership won him many awards. He received the highest award of the Department of the Interior and 3 honorary doctorates. Then in 1976, he found himself once again at Custer Battlefield, giving the keynote address at the 100th anniversary of the Custer Battle. Meanwhile, Bob had matured and no longer worshipped Custer. He edited the papers of Custer's officer, Albert Barnitz, and his wife, who judged Custer disgusting and tyrannical. While Bob believed that Custer had positive aspects, he could show his sense of humor by sharing a photograph with anthropologist Jack Ewers and his wife, holding a T-shirt saying, "Custer had it coming." After 7 long years, Bob and Melody wanted to get married. Bob convinced his boss to abolish his high-ranking job so he could retire with a pension in 1980 in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Bob wasted no time. 2 days after getting married, they purchased their first car. Then 1 month later, they bought a new passive solar home. Although Melody still worked, she believed it was her civic duty to join the El Dorado Fire Department. Bob doubted that being a fire department was something he needed to do, but he wanted to share her world. Initially, they wore 1960s protective gear and drove a 1947 fire engine. Just 2 years later, the department owned a new fire engine, modern protective gear, and Melody became assistant chief and Bob a lieutenant. Retirement satisfied Bob. He had time to write books, enjoy life, and travel with Melody. 2 memorable events occurred in 1983. One was returning to Logan Canyon, where Bob and Melody first got together at a 1973 Writers' Conference. Then, at the Salt Lake City Western History Association meeting, several of Bob's younger friends gave him a surprise party. 70 people attended the dinner and gave him a standing ovation as he entered the room. He thought he was in the wrong room and tried to walk out. Throughout the 1980s, the El Dorado Fire Department became important to Bob and Melody. They seldom fought house fires. Instead, they usually wound up at the dump, with Bob holding the hose. Bob especially enjoyed reunions with his old friends. Once he and Melody went to Fort Benning for his 30th reunion of Officer Candidate School. Then in 1985, his oldest friend, Bill Brown, showed up to help celebrate Bob's 56th birthday. After Melody became superintendent of Lyndon B. Johnson National Historical Park, they bought a large house 20 miles from the park with a swimming pool, just right for parties. There were special occasions when the LBJ Library held black-tie dinners, such as the 25th anniversary of President Johnson's inauguration and Lady Bird's 80th birthday. Bob and Melody also arranged a big barbecue for attendees of the Western History Association on the banks of the Pedernales River at the LBJ Ranch. Once when Bob gave a lecture at Lincoln County Courthouse in New Mexico, he found himself arguing with another Billy the Kid author on how Billy escaped. Ironically, both authors died within a week of each other. In September 1992, Bob and Melody transferred to Grand Teton National Park and into a log house built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in 1933. It was called the Superintendent's Residence, even though Melody was only assistant superintendent. They made one last trip to LBJ to celebrate the massive conversion of an old hospital into a beautiful visitor center, largely done while Melody was superintendent. Congressman Jake Pickle also received a Ranger hat for funding the visitor center. In 1994, Bob had won 2 awards at the Conference of Western Writers of America. He received a Spur Award for The Lance and the Shield, and a large bison sculpture for Lifetime Achievement. Also, during the 1990s, television documentaries on the West boomed. Bob found himself in great demand and appeared in nearly 80 various productions.
With a lifestyle that guaranteed independence and practically no authority and lots of excitement.
Often exhausted with the long days, he still reveled in the attention.
The Chiricahuas from that Apache Pass reservation were all uprooted and taken to San Carlos. That's when Geronimo decided he did not want to go there.
During the 1990s, Bob enjoyed riding in Don's personally rebuilt 1983 Austin Healey and sharing Thanksgiving dinner with Phil. Meanwhile, several guests came to the Tetons to visit. One was Dave Evans, who guided Melody down the Yukon River over a 3-month period in 1976, looking for historic sites. Another 2 were the owners of the oil painting done by Henry Ration that became the cover for The Lance and the Shield. More important for Bob was living in the superintendent's residence, listed on the National Register of Historic Places, that in 1966 he helped establish. As the years passed, Bob's mobility diminished and the number of trips decreased. In 2013 in Oklahoma City, Bob's book Geronimo won a Wrangler sculpture from the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum. This time, Bob's editor, Chris Rogers, was awarded a sculptor as well. Also in 2013, old friends from Australia came to tour Arizona. Fortunately, Bob held up well. On Bob's 90th birthday in 2019, he received a T-shirt that said, "It took me 90 years to look this good." 2 years later, Larry McGrath photographed Bob surrounded by his books, awards, and sculptors for the April 2021 cover of V magazine. Bob continued to be involved in the community and decorated his motor scooter for the Christmas parade, the only scooter. Bob's last photo from his 22 photo albums was his Christmas card for 2021, celebrating his last book award, a Spur Award for his final book, The Last Sovereigns, Sitting Bull and the Resistance of the Free Lakota.
everyone. Thank you. Sherry Smith is a historian of the Native American and Western history. Now an emeritus professor of Southern Methodist University, but still actively researching and writing. She says she's been trying to follow Bob's model. She met Bob in the earliest days of her professional career when she was writing about the United States Army and its Indian Wars. He, of course, was the preeminent historian in that field, and she claims she was a total novice. But he welcomed her, and they remained friends ever since. Sherry.
When I received word that Bob Utley had died, I searched my collection of note cards to find the perfect one to send my condolences to Melody. And when I found one that featured Ansel Adams' famous photograph of Mount Moran in Grand Teton National Park, I knew I had found the perfect image. Some of you know, if you didn't before, you know now, that Melody and Bob spent 4 years in Grand Teton National Park when Melody served as assistant superintendent. And some of you know what the Tetons look like, or if you didn't, you just saw a picture of the Tetons. The centerpiece is called the Cathedral Group, and that's those sharp, dramatic peaks, the sort of classic mountain look, what mountains are supposed to look like. They rise precipitously from the valley floor, and they are undeniably breathtaking. Mount Moran rarely makes that postcard. It stands apart and alone from these showy peaks. It is solid and imposing and distinctive as it rises behind Jackson Lake on its own, flat-topped and grand in its own way. In fact, it is so dramatic and so impressive that the wonderful writer Terry Tempest Williams, who spent many childhood days in the Tetons, always thought Moran was the Grand Teton until somebody set her straight. Well, Bob, to me, is a human corollary to Mount Moran. His stature as a historian put him in a singularly striking, independent, and elevated position, certainly from the rest of us. So, like with Paul, his passing came as a shock to me. I guess I too considered him immortal. He was so solid, he was so steady, and he was so grand. My path crossed with Bob's and Melody's in two arenas. Bob often said that his feet stood in two worlds, one, the world of academic scholarship, and the other in the world of public history or applied history. Although I've devoted most of my time to the former, I have also pursued a secondary interest in historic preservation. And Bob's work has been incredibly important to me in both. So what I want to talk about briefly is the quality and continued importance of Bob's work in academic and public history. But also, I want to convey how his contributions went beyond excellent books and groundbreaking federal policies to the impact that he had on many other people, including me. But the impact that he had was because of the human being that he was. It is in the end his character, his kindness, his generosity, his wit, his honesty, his modesty, his integrity, and his encouragement of others that I remember and cherish most of all. Let me start with his scholarship. Bob began publishing deeply researched, clearly and accessibly written books on Western history in the early 1960s. And the earliest were these titles: The Last Days of the Sioux Nation, which came out in 1963, followed by Frontiersmen in Blue, the United States Army and the Indian, 1848 to 1865, Frontier Regulars, the United States Army and the Indian, 1866 to 1891, The American Heritage History of the Indian Wars, and Life in Custer's Cavalry, Diaries and Letters of Albert and Jenny Barnett. Now, these are just his early titles. But you can see that his expertise on the US military side of the wars with and against Native people went very, very deep. In fact, the scope and scale of these books, not to mention all those that would come, established Bob as the Dean of Western History and also the Dean of Indian Wars History, a title he continues to this very moment. In the late 1970s, I was a PhD student looking for a dissertation topic. So when I went to meet my advisor and suggested I might like to do something in this emerging field of women's history, maybe something to do with women and the Indian policy reform of the late 19th century. And this guy, he just blanched, it was clear he was not interested in that topic. And so he quickly made it clear that what he wanted me to write about was officers' views of Native Americans and their thoughts about the wars that they fought with them. Being a dutiful student, I agreed, although I knew absolutely nothing about military history, the Army, or Indian wars. But my very first purchase as I began this project was Bob's 2-volume Frontiersmen in Blue and Frontier Regulars. And they became super invaluable sources for me. I didn't know who Bob was. I didn't know whether he had a PhD or not. All I knew was they were impeccably researched books that provided the necessary foundation for my project. In fact, I see Utley's books on the Army in the West, and this is mostly for the historians in the group, as corollaries to Paul Gates's monumental works on U.S. Land law and Father Paul Pruka's works on U.S. Indian policy. The careful research, the attention to detail, the insistence on getting things right, and the amazing scope of their works joined all three of these men and made their works classics that are as relevant and useful today as they were when they first appeared, now decades ago. A number of years later, once my dissertation became a book, I was invited to participate in a one-day conference at Yale University on the Indian Wars. Bob Utley, of course, was the featured speaker. And in fact, the whole day was really built, I think, around him. Paul Hutton was also involved, a star in his own right. I felt underqualified, but honored to participate. And of course, I accepted the invitation. That evening, while in my hotel room, I received a phone call. Bob and Paul asked me to join them for a beer in a bar across the street. I was a bit intimidated, but of course I went. And Bob and Paul welcomed me with such incredible warmth and graciousness. I was starstruck, but I quickly realized that Bob might be the dean of Western and Indian Wars history, but he was much more interested in being my friend. Ever after, Bob greeted me with that same warmth and encouragement, as I know he did many other younger scholars, some of whom are in this room. He became a model to me of how one should conduct oneself in our profession. Do your best work, and then foster, affirm, and applaud the best in others, especially those younger than yourself. As for the public history arena, only later did I learn how central Bob was to writing the National Historic Preservation Act and how hard he worked to create the administrative apparatus, and also how hard he had to work to convince federal land managers of all stripes that they must adhere to this law and they must protect cultural resources. It's just an amazing effort he made here. I'll leave it to others, speakers, to talk more about Bob's huge contributions to the National Park Service, but I want to tell one story about how that part of his life and mine intersected. Bob Ryder, my husband and fellow historian, and I have been part-time residents of Jackson Hole since the 1980s. And we were deeply distressed that the superintendent of Grand Teton National Park was totally negligent regarding responsibilities with respect to cultural resources. There was nothing we or others in the community or the State Historic Preservation Office or the Denver National Park Service cultural resource people could do to sway that superintendent from his determination to really destroy historic sites in the park. In 1991, Bob Utley and I both spoke at a Montana history conference. And since we both lived in Texas at the time, we shared a plane ride back and even sat in the same row of seats. And all the way from I guess Helena to Denver, I was regaling him with stories about what was happening in Grand Teton National Park, and he was very sympathetic to my plight. And then he leaned across the empty seat in between me and he said quite simply, "Sue them." Well, that was a shock, and it was a great idea, except they didn't have those kind of resources. However, a year later, first of all, he reasserted my conviction that what we were trying to do was the right thing to do. And that was very helpful in the moment, but not long after. And I remember exactly where I was when I read the local newspaper story that announced Melody Webb was going to be the assistant superintendent of Grand Teton National Park. We were jubilant. Not only was a historian going to be in that very important position, but the guy who wrote the preservation law was coming with her. So that was a big boost for us. Of course, change doesn't happen overnight anywhere, and it took a while, but that was a turning point for sure in Grand Teton National Park. And now some of those valuable sites that were moldering ruins in the early 1990s are now restored and are beloved by park administrators and visitors alike. And that is just one tiny little example of the way in which Bob's public history work has left a lasting legacy on our Western and national landscapes and on my own backyard. Bob Utley was a giant in both academic and public history. He taught, influenced, and touched so many. He leaves a rich legacy of books and federal policies and practices. But I remember and honor him most for the kind of person he was, a fellow Hoosier, a fellow Purdue University history major, a man who was kind and funny and insistent on integrity in research and writing and in implementing public policy. He was confident, but he was also modest, I think, and incredibly gracious, inspirational, and uplifting to others. He was simply one of the best human beings I've ever known. That's my little short piece.
Thank you, Sherry. I share your opinion. Chuck Rankin was former editor at Montana, the Magazine of Western History, and later editor-in-chief for the University of Oklahoma Press. He worked with Bob, for some 25 years on a variety of books and articles. Bob was one of his favorite authors and a true friend. Chuck is retired now and lives in Helena, Montana. Chuck.
Thank you, Melody. I want to thank Melody also, and Mark and Dwayne for that wonderful video presentation, which sets up some of my remarks perfectly because it locates things geographically. Melody asked me to comment on Bob's books and other writing and on what it was like to work with Bob as an editor. The second item is easier, so I'll take it first. Bob was the consummate writing professional. For someone so accomplished, he was forever open to honest criticism from those he respected. In fact, he invited it. He would take all suggestions, accept what he liked, and move on. Only a writer extremely confident of his abilities could do that with Bob's aplomb. As for his writing, his 23 books, 14 brochures, 30 introductions and forewords, and more than 80 articles attest to how he loved to write. Early on, Bob branded himself a narrative historian, someone who would move comfortably among academics and their world, but as he said, not have to play by their rules. He always aimed at the larger audience. To make sense of the breadth and variety of his writing in my allotted 5 minutes requires an approach the ancestors used to understand the stars. They grouped in order to grasp. One way to do that is to see his books as Bob saw them, grouped according to success, as defined by sales. Contribution, both in historical study and to Bob's career, would make a different list. 3 of his books, all biographies, were most successful: Sitting Bull, Billy the Kid, and Custer. All 3 were based either on previous work or produced related studies, and all were award winners. Another way to group his work is by military and non-military themes. Sherry talked a little bit about the military. 12 books, a majority, can be thought military, including his 2 volumes on the Frontier Army and his incomparable brochures on forts and historic sites. Other topics include Indians, mountain men, the Texas Rangers, historic preservation, and public issues involving history. Bob's work can also be understood by geography, his personal geography. Where Bob lived often determined what he did. The overlap of projects, time for research, unexpected opportunities, and the long gestation for publication often obscures what Bob was working on when, but a general pattern does emerge. While in Washington, D.C., he spent his evenings at work at the National Archives, completing his first major book, Last Days of the Sioux Nation. A later residence in D.C. would support work on his seminal Macmillan histories of the Frontier Army. When later he went to Santa Fe with the National Park Service, he plunged into work on historical sites in the Southwest. Later, when he and Melody lived in El Dorado above Santa Fe, he turned to a perennial New Mexican topic and produced Billy the Kid, A Short and Violent Life, his most successful book until then. That book rested on two others, High Noon in Lincoln and Four Fighters of Lincoln County. When he and Melody moved to Texas, where Melody would superintend the LBJ Ranch, and later when they lived in Georgetown, he produced two major volumes on the Texas Rangers. When Melody took the assistant superintendent's position at Grand Teton National Park, they moved into quarters number 1, which afforded Bob a view of the incomparable Teton Range. For a historian, those peaks led easily to dreams of the fur trade, and Bob soon turned to his Mountain Man book, A Life Wild and Perilous. Opportunities then led them back to Texas and to the hill country near Austin, where Bob would complete his work on the Texas Rangers and, thankfully for many reasons, including the historical record, his memoir, Custer and Me. I had the privilege of working with Bob on that one. Bob and Melody's subsequent move to Scottsdale in 2009 afforded them time to travel. One trip to Australia spurred Bob's interest in the down-under outlaw Ned Kelly, whose colorful career so paralleled Billy the Kid. The result was his book, Wanted, The Outlaw Lives of Billy the Kid and Ned Kelly. Scottsdale also put him in Geronimo country, and sure enough, soon came a biography of the Apache chief. Grouping Bob's work in this way has one caveat. Ultimately, everything sprang from his love of military history and George Armstrong Custer. Early on, as you've heard elsewhere, infatuation with Errol Flynn and the movie They Died with Their Boots On led to his Custer and the Great Controversy, and later to his Custer biography, Cavalier in Buckskin. After that, as he said, it was time to cross the Little Bighorn battle lines, which led to his most successful book, The Lance and the Shield, his award-winning biography of Sitting Bull. That book, like so many others, produced a related study that materialized in 2020 as The Last Sovereigns, Sitting Bull and the Resistance of the Free Lakota. Bob never escaped the gravitational pull of Custer in the military or of his need to write. As he told me, and no doubt others, Melody says, if I don't write, I'll die. So write he did. 2 years before The Last Sovereigns, he produced The Commanders, Civil War generals who shaped the West. And he was at work just this year on a biography of William Tecumseh Sherman. Unfortunately, he did not live to finish that one, and we need a new biography of Sherman. Other books related to the American military also dot his career. The memoirs of Richard Henry Pratt, the Barnett's diaries and letters, and the journals and letters of John Vance Lauderdale. It is a stunning list. As Paul Hutton has said, we shall not see the likes of Bob Utley, historian and writer, anytime soon again, if ever. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck. Like Bob, Jerry Rogers began his National Park Service career as a seasonal historian. In the summer of 1964 at Fort Davis, he became friends with Bob just before Bob moved on to Washington to become chief historian of the National Park Service. In 1967, Bob recruited Jerry as part of a small staff to develop the National Register of Historic Places and other programs that Bob was organizing. With Bob as a mentor, colleague, and friend, Jerry eventually became head of all of Bob's historic preservation programs as the National Park Service's Associate Director for Cultural Resources. Jerry.
Thank you, Melody. A young Bob Utley was excited by the romance of the American past, but he matured, unlike some of us, to search beyond the mythology and to look for genuine history. Bob transferred that excitement to the actual history and enabled multitudes to share in it. It's very hard to believe that he left the National Park Service 45 years ago, because I never stopped thinking of him in terms of the service, the historic places it preserves, the places it helps others to preserve, and the ideals to which it aspires. And neither, I think, did he. A summer job in 1947 at what was then Custer Battlefield National Monument taught Bob to understand a historic landscape as a document. Landscapes, for those who learn to read them, hold a different form of information than accounts on paper. The shapes and slopes of a river and its uplands, the grass and the brush and the trees all tell us stories about human events on the land. Decades later, he would help to apply that philosophy to urban streetscapes completely unlike a Montana prairie. The historic place and the National Park Service helped to shape Bob, and afterward, Bob helped to shape the National Park Service and its new task in historic preservation. A Southwest regional historian, Bob shaped the National Park Service by the new units he helped to create. Fort Bowie National Historic Site remains today one of my favorite parks because Bob helped to set it on a path of minimal National Park Service visible presence. There, with minimal coaching, a visitor discovers the history rather than having it shown to him, reads the landscape, and listens to its quiet voice. Hubble Trading Post National Historic Site, to a rare degree, captures, without killing or embalming, a past, and Bob had a strong hand in that place's remaining a living and functioning trading post. Promontory Summit, scene of one of history's greatest engineering achievements, is now Golden Spike National Historic Site because Bob Utley fought to overcome the disdain of higher officials. It didn't have tall green trees. To them, it didn't look like a national park was supposed to look. History and the service still had a long uphill battle. Bob was fundamental in creation of Fort Davis National Historic Site, and his, as Melody said, his 1964 visit there just before moving to Washington, D.C. as chief historian also linked him to this Ranger historian in my first summer with the service. He found in Washington the energetic Great Society of Lyndon Johnson, the visionary Stuart Udall as Secretary of the Interior, and a powerhouse director named George Hartzog atop a very traditional National Park Service that was not comfortable with many of the new things its leaders would ask of it. One of those new things was the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, which Bob helped to conceive, involving a presidentially appointed advisory council on historic preservation and a potentially vast National Register of Historic Places. Bob had to prepare the service to lead a partnership of federal agencies, states and territories, cities and counties, Native American tribes, and the private sector in applying ecosystem concepts to historical areas. This required creation of something akin to a monuments agency such as European nations had long enjoyed. The United States version was to be an Office of Archaeology and Historic Preservation in the National Park Service. Fully 6 months before Ernest Allen Conley arrived in June of 1967 to lead that office, Bob had it up and running. And hired by Bob, I went to work on the same day as Conley, but at the very opposite end of the hierarchy. Conley headed the office and Bob made it work. But the National Park Service had concentrated for 50 years on preserving only a few select great places, especially places with tall green trees. And it was characterized by independent national park superintendents whose authority was likened to that of captains of ships at sea. It struggled to comprehend, let alone to lead, the broad cultural environment approach of the new law, and even to realize that that law applied to the parks and not just to those agencies that were plowing giant projects through cities and countrysides. Imagine, and I could name that superintendent at Grand Teton. Imagine the explosion when the Wyoming State Historic Preservation Officer showed up in Yellowstone and showed that old-time ship's captain superintendent, told that old-time superintendent that he was there to survey the park's historic structures. Public demand grew for an independent agency that was not subordinate to park priorities and preconceptions. Bob soon understood that need and moved over to a leadership post in the Independent Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. A decade of ferment in the preservation world ended in President Jimmy Carter's creation of a Heritage Conservation and Recreation Service. And it was utterly unlike a European monuments agency, and it failed for reasons of its own. After 3 years, in 1981, the historic preservation programs returned to the National Park Service, along with the remnants of what had been the Bureau of Outdoor Recreation. Bob noted then that it was time to stop worrying about the incompatibilities of a broad-scaled historic preservation program and a park-oriented national park system, and time now to work toward making them compatible. That became the goal of the rest of my own National Park Service career. Neither Bob's departure from the National Park Service in 1977 nor his retirement in 1980 diminished in my mind his image as fundamentally a part of the National Park Service. In addition to his scholarly works and to his important contribution as house husband to Melody Webb as she made her own mark in the service, Bob was soon an elder whose advice was sought by many. That continued to life's end. The National Park Service and the historic preservation movement today are better because of Bob's role in shaping them, for hiring me twice actually, for 75 years of service, for the many of us whom he inspired and helped, and for the works left behind that continue to inspire and inform. Thank you, Bob Utley.
Thank you, Jerry. Chris Rogers, who could not be here today, was Bob's editor at Yale University Press, where they collaborated on the award-winning biography of Geronimo. After retiring, Chris became Bob's agent at Dunroe, Carlson, and Lerner, where he edited and marketed Bob's award-winning book, The Last Sovereigns. That was Bob's last book. Paula Fortier, who is my niece, agreed to read Chris Rogers' tribute to Bob. She is also deputy librarian for the city of Phoenix. Paula.
Bob Utley was already a legend in Western American history before I met him at Western Historical Association meeting. The occasion was my calling together the editorial board of Yale University Press's Lamar series in Western history to introduce myself as its new editor. After the meeting, Bob and his wife Melody and I went out for dinner, which began a friendship and an annual ritual of martinis and steaks. That dinner was for me a most enlightening education in Western history. But more than that, it was the beginning of a great friendship and professional collaboration with Bob. Right there on that first night, Bob adopted me as his editor, much to my surprise and delight. Our first book together would be a biography of Geronimo for Yale. Why Geronimo, I asked. Because of the challenge, he said. Because he seemed like a ghost. The primary sources from his early years were virtually non-existent. His later years were skewed by his own embellished autobiography. No one had gotten his life right. In several exchanges on the manuscript, Bob would have questions for me. Often I would ask Bob, "But where's Geronimo?" And Bob never blinked. He usually said something very much to the point, short and sweet, as was his wont. "Chris, you're right. Truth is, he is a ghost, but I'll work on it." In the end, he succeeded well beyond my expectations in bringing the ghost to life. Always cordial, always willing to work harder, Bob took the advice of this naive reader seriously and revised laboriously to create what turned out to be a masterpiece. The most elusive Apache agent of resistance became a sympathetic character on the page. Geronimo went on to win Best Nonfiction of 2013 from the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum, the Wrangler Award, and the Best Nonfiction and Biography Award from the Western Writers of America, the Spur Award. One of the high points of my career was attending the ceremony in Oklahoma City and seeing just what a rock star Bob Utley was among the Stetsons, impressive belt buckles, and tuxes and blue jeans of that night. I was thrilled. Years later, I became a literary agent around the same time Bob had a new idea for a book about Sitting Bull's last days of freedom. Thus was born The Last Sovereigns, Sitting Bull and the Resistance of the Free Lakotas, that depicted Sitting Bull and several thousand Lakotas fleeing the violent hand of the U.S. cavalry and the reservation life. The sources were again scarce and sketchy, and again, Bob persevered and found a way to tell a moving story of Native resistance. Bob would write me saying he wasn't sure about something, and I would encourage him not to give up. He never gave up. The result was another award-winning narrative history that, like Geronimo, is a minor masterpiece of storytelling, not unlike the best of Hemingway. They say growing old is not for the faint of heart. Bob was seriously compromised during his last years, but he was one tough hombre. As aging depleted him, he never blinked. He always showed up. He kept working and challenging conventional wisdom with his gifted mind and pen. I will miss the old bison a lot. I already do. He was so warm and engaging as a person, sweet in disposition, tough in matters of the mind, and just so special on so many levels. I know so many of us will miss him as a scholar, a writer, and Melody, not least, as a husband and friend. Rest in peace, old friend.
Thank you, Paula. Bob's sons, Don and Phil, were unable to attend Bob's celebration of life. Despite their best efforts, they could not change inflexible commitments and constraints. They had great regrets. Now I would like to open the floor to anyone who would like to provide a remembrance or some comments or some stories about Bob.
My name's John Bloom. I go back to 1960 with Bob. In the 1950s, in historical circles, interest in the Civil War was ginning up. My professor, my mentor at Emory University, was author of 2 books, foundational books on soldier life in the Civil War. He let me lead myself to study of soldier life in the Mexican War. And there were so few other people interested in soldier life at this time. Don Rickey comes to mind, Jerry Rogers, remember him very well. Other Park people will also. I wound up on the faculty at what was then Texas Western College of the University of Texas, far western outpost of upper education. It's now UTEP and has established itself as a very reputable school. In 1959, 1960, a couple of men were circulating around, and I was not too happy with my career in teaching. Bob Utley was one of them. He talked me into leaving, turning down tenure to join in a committee in St. Louis at the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial. 1960, conjure that name and what it terms when we're talking about colonialism now and so much. Jefferson National Expansion Memorial. Brief history there. In the 1930s, St. Louis had ginned up a promotion for a monument on the waterfront, and World War II cut it short. They were back working on it, and there was to be a museum at the base of the Grand Arch at St. Louis waterfront. We got together a remarkable little group of people to start planning this museum. Then they started building the arch, and there was no money left for the museum. And we scattered. I was shipped back to Washington and briefly edited a series of books that never really quite took off on historic preservation. Others of this group were scattered here and there. The other person who was making my acquaintance in 1960 was a charismatic, no other word to put it, man named Jack Carroll, John Alexander Carroll. It was he more than Bob, but Bob was involved in it. He more than Bob, who was ginning up the establishment of the Western History Association. The meeting to set up, to start the ball going was in Santa Fe, and Bob was there and I was there from JNEM, and I wound up being secretary of the thing. In our first programs, which I was responsible for printing as secretary treasurer, were little folders that would go in a man's vest pocket. Here's this year's program. I'm not sure how many pages, but in the listings of programs here are dozens and dozens, scores of Western historians. I wish that I'd had the chance to show the inside front cover of this program. You can barely make out the image there. This is Sarah Jackson. She was the military specialist in archives at National Archives, and Bob Atler worked with her, I know, and all of the other military historians and a lot of other historians did also. And I was out of touch when an award was set up for her in her honor, and I contributed to it, which is what prompted them to put this in the program now. But to wind up, the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the Western History Association was 12 years ago, meeting in In-Kind Village in Nevada, and Bob Utley and I were called on to speak on this occasion. I remember conjuring up a smart-ass report for John Wonder, for the president then, and he had his nerve, didn't he? Sitting and giving the microphone over to two old farts like Bob Utley and me. Well, I know Bob Utley didn't disappoint him, and I hope I didn't. And thanks for this opportunity to enjoy the swirling around my head of so many wonderful people from years ago.
Thank you, Melody. Bob was a great friend, and I owe him a lot. And this is just kind of a personal memoir. Robert M. Utley graced my life and career for more than 50 years. I first learned of him in March 1963, when my wife tendered me a birthday gift of Custer in the Great Controversy while I was stationed with the Army at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. As an ardent Custer buff, I was impressed with its depth, clarity, and presentation by an author whose name I initially pronounced as Utley. The volume would serve significantly in terms of the course of my own life and career. Nor did I realize that the man I ultimately came to know and revere might so influence my own ultimate career as a National Park Service research historian. I first met Mr. Utley at the then Custer Battlefield National Monument in Montana when he, in 1968, when he visited the park where I worked as a new seasonal ranger historian. He was then National Park Service chief historian. We made small talk. I saw him next at a Western History Association in Omaha, and he remembered me. In 1970, I again worked at the battlefield when Bob visited, this time with his boss, Ernest Allen Conley, then director of the National Park Service Office of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. When the superintendent asked me to present the Little Bighorn story to an audience with them in attendance, I was hesitant. But at its conclusion, Bob came up and complimented me. It made me feel like $1 million. While at the battlefield, yet again in 1971, I was offered a position as instructor of Native American history at Haskell Indian Junior College in Kansas, for which I had earlier interviewed. I accepted. 2 days later, I received a direct call from Bob offering me a full-time historian position in Washington. Because I had already accepted the job at Haskell, I felt ethically obliged to decline his offer. After 2 years at Haskell, along with all other non-Native American employees on the staff, I was abruptly terminated. At that, I diligently revamped my federal forms and sent them off to Bob, who forwarded them on to the Denver Service Center, a new National Park Service professional office organized and dedicated to meeting the needs of the upcoming American bicentennial. Timing was everything. And with Bob's helpful guidance in July 1973, I became a National Park Service research historian. When my first book coincidentally appeared that summer, I sent Bob a copy, and he responded graciously with a flattering missive that I yet cherish. That was so like Bob then and ever after. When computers became the norm, we frequently exchanged emails, and I've retained them all. When Bob spoke in Denver, he stayed at my place. And when he presented at the 2007 Fort Robinson, Nebraska History Conference, I met him at the airport and drove him there and back. He was always pleasantly forthright, helpful, and gracious with me throughout my National Park Service career. I should add that he helped many others too. Bob was a meticulous researcher and writer, significant in his ability to project knowledge of Native people with clarity and respect, although he covered other Western themes too. His books always reflected solid analysis and ever meaningful prose, but they well exemplify his love of writing and his veneration of Native American views. Bob will always be remembered as an authoritative historian whose contributions projected an ever-conscious humanity. For all of the physical adversity that he endured in his long life, I wish him eternal peace. Thank you.